Greetings, store friends. Today, let's take a look at a new offering sent for review by Romance of Man, the Surudoi Katana of Unokubi-Zukuri blade geometry. So Romance of Man is a relatively new sword making company on the market. They contacted me 3 years ago, offering to send me a few review samples. Unfortunately, their message was filtered out by the corporate spam filter by mistake, and I recovered those messages earlier this year, and I contacted them. They still sent 2 katanas my way, which is extremely cool, and the quality of their products really surprised me as a first impression. And I think for the price they charge, they offer quite a bit of unique features that make their products stand out from the rest of the market in the price category. So the Surudoi is one of the 2 katanas that sent me. Has a unique blade geometry and some very interesting hilt designs on the different components, which we'll go over later. But they also sent me another sword, the Abusive katana of the ocean theme design, unique lobster and shrimp motif on the hilt components, but also very interesting differentially hardening on the blade with very unique hamon patterns, which I will review next week, so stay tuned. Now going back to the maker, Romance of Man, which is based in Longquan, China. It's kind of a peculiar name, but romance is a word that in its antiquated form actually means legend. So Romance of Man basically means legend of Nan. And the Surudoi katana has a price tag of $155, which is extremely reasonable, basically on the lowest end of functional katanas. In this price range, what customers can realistically hope for are only some of the functional features, such as very tight ito wrapping that wouldn't loosen up during use, tight assemblies of hilt components, no rattly or anything, but also visual designs that has a minimal impact on the handling of the sword. There's nothing that's jutting out or create any hot spot on the hilt. But for the blade, you basically can only hope for something that's very straightforward and simple. Shinogi-zukuri blade that has the basic geometries, the most iconic Japanese sword form, ridge below the spine that doesn't change in thickness, and the blade bevel actually starts from the shinogi line, that ridge, to the edge, either with a flat grind or with some convex geometry called niku. Of course, in today's day and age, customers are lucky enough to get reasonably well-designed shinogi-zukuri swords with a durable blade made of competent steel and heat treatment. And as a customer, if you are diligent enough to do some research, you'll be able to acquire one of those, but you simply cannot hope for anything unique that stands out. This is where the Surudoi katana comes in. Basically, it has hilt fittings, tsuba and fushikashira, that's unique from any other katanas, especially the mass-produced one from Longquan. It has a very prominent motif on all the hilt fittings, the tsuba and fushikashira, and internally consistent aesthetically. If we look at the blade geometry, that's Unokubi-Zukuri, means heron's beak in Japanese. It actually implemented the correct dimensions and proportions that make the sword properly lively and lightweight, which is basically the purpose of this unique blade geometry. As you can see, apart from the usual ridge, it's called the shinogi line, under the spine, called mune in Japanese, it has another fuller other than the primary broad fuller called bohi. There's a secondary fuller called sohi that runs pretty much 90% of the blade's length. But the primary bohi that reduces a lot of weight from the blade terminates at about 2/3 of the blade's length from the base on this model. And then it transitions into a unique geometry that peels back from the shinogi-G line. So it's almost like the spine is beveled, but it's not terminating into a sharp edge, but instead somewhat a narrow ridge that's flat. So essentially, this is still a single-edged sword, right? Unlike some of the other blade geometries like Moroha-Zukuri that has a false edge on the upper portion of the blade. The blade is still very strong on the upper portion, yet it reduces even more mass from the blade, right? Rather than having a long bulky that runs pretty much the entire length of the blade. This results in a very lively feeling katana, right? Comparatively speaking, as we know that katanas are basically more cumbersome to use than pretty much any blade from other blade making cultures. The reason is that the blade doesn't have a lot of profile taper or distal taper. They do become thinner and narrower on the upper portion of the blade, usually 20 to 40% narrower and thinner. So the blade doesn't feel like a stick when you swing it, obviously, but it's closer to a stick than blades from any other region. Of course, you can avoid this cumbersome feeling by making the blades shorter, which is why even though katanas, the full-size katanas anyway, are always two-handed in the hilt length, the blade is pretty short, right? Equivalent to a single-handed sword in other blade-making cultures. Of course, this is a trait of shinogi-zukuri, right? The most stereotypical katana. However, if we look at the Unokubi-Zukuri, which is a blade geometry that's commonly found on naginata, bladed spear, essentially, with usually a 20-inch long blade, sometimes shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, mounted on a pole. The reason they use this geometry is unknown, but if you make a full-length katana blade with this blade geometry, they tend to be much nimbler, and it rotates much more easily than a shinogi-zukuri katana. Obviously, many makers have caught on this fact in recent years. They started making various Unokubi-Zukuri katanas, so it has become overrepresented on today's reproduction market. However, to have a blade in this geometry, the Unokubi-Zukuri, you usually have to pay more because it's more complex to make than the most stereotypical shinogi-zukuri blades. Now, for $155, you get a sword with this blade geometry not only implemented correctly, but also does the job properly to incorporate more distal taper over the entire length of the blade. Now you see, there has been some other models by other makers that also has the Unokubi-Zukuri geometry, such as this Wenitoshi Viper, which is one of the first products to sport this blade geometry. Used to be a very popular model before it was discontinued. And you can see there are some differences in the implementation of the Unokubi-Zukuri on the Wenitoshi Viper over here than the Surudoi by Romance of Man. You can see here the soki, the secondary fuller on the older Wenitoshi Viper, is much shorter than the Surudoi. Also, you can see the transition from the fuller section to the beveled section on the spine happens a lot later on the blade. So this reduces less mass on the blade, obviously, but also the blade stops having a distal taper once it transitions to this cross section, right, at about halfway on the blade. So it carries this thickness for the remaining 60% of the blade. This results in a rather lightweight sword, coming in usually around 2 pounds. This one at 2 pounds and 2 ounces. For this weight, you will think it moves very fast, right? Very nimble. But when you swing it, it isn't as nimble as you would hope. And I think that's largely due to the lack of distal taper on the upper portion, right? There's some on the lower portion when there's the bulky running along the blade. In test cutting, this blade still works very well, and you can launch very fast cuts, still with a lot of authority, because it still carries a lot of mass on the upper portion of the blade, even though it's a relatively lightweight sword. If we compare this to the Surudoi by Romance of Men, this is clearly balanced closer to the hilt. You can see it's at a little bit further than 4 inches from the tsuba. So this is very lightweight still, around 1 kilogram. That's 2 pounds, 3 ounces. It's extremely fast, right? Especially when you operate it with 2 hands. The rate of rotation is extremely fast, with all the mass evenly distributed along the 28-inch blade. Obviously less so on the upper portion. You can also hear the sword wind, tashikaze, generated by this blade. It's quite a loud blade. Just like any other Unokubi-Zukuri sword because of the dual filler on the blade. And you can see this Munitoshi Viper is a slightly slower sword, despite being lighter than the Surudoi by Romance of Man. So I think this is definitely easier to use, especially for beginners. We look at the degree of distal taper. Both swords start just over 7 millimeters at the base, and this one tapers more to about 5 millimeters at halfway across the blade, just at a transition from the bulky section to the beveled section on the spine. Whereas this tapers a little less comparing to the Surudoi, the Munitoshi Viper does, and it stops the tapering once it transitions to the bevel section. You can see on the upper portion of the Surudoi katana, it has also less width, a lot less than the base. So this degree of profile taper that loses about 1/3 of the blade's width on the upper portion comparing to the base, and lost more than 40% of the blade's thickness, give it a very lively feeling. Yet it still implements the iconic feature of the Unokubi-Zukuri on the tip correctly, with a swelled up tip thickness. So this tip is reinforced. It doesn't become very thin to be less durable. When I did some initial handling of the sword, such as some quick waggling to test its polar movements, my daughter saw me from the other room and remarked on how effortlessly the sword could be handled and how loud the sword wind was. So look at the edge geometry. It's one flat grind from the shinogi-ji line, or rather the soki, the secondary filler, to the edge, with a V section. There's no muscle on the blade. So this wouldn't be a very durable blade, but it's a very fast blade. Also performs well because the edge angle with this V wedge is much smaller than one with convex geometry. So it cuts very well. Also easy to generate velocity from any position. Do any shortcut, it's very easy. And also it's very easy to stop and redirect. So if you want to do a lot of double cuts, triple cuts, or trick cuts, this is a very good blade to work with, right? Even more so than the famed Munitoshi Viper, although this one has a little bit more authority. Even so, it still has some trouble cutting through large targets like 30, 40-pound pumpkins, as you can see here. Many other swords with longer blades, weightier blades, can cut through those pumpkins with certain ease, whereas this katana, right, the Unokubi-Zukuri katana, just has some trouble. Obviously, the Surudoi by Romance of Man, having even less mass on the upper portion of the blade, will also have some trouble as well going through large and dense targets. But for light cutting, trick cutting, it's a very good blade to practice with.
see the cap being cleaved in half cleanly. No edge damage whatsoever. So really reliable edge retention. Look at this. This is flat. So you see, these Asian beverages have very hard plastic bottle, and the sword was able to cut through pretty cleanly, several cuts, and the last one went through the bottom, which is harder and thicker, and with some fluting, went through without any problem. And they also cut into the hole a couple of sand deeply. The padding just carried all the sand all the way down, brought it all the way to the ground. But this amount of pressure didn't really bend the blade. It remained perfectly true. So it's a testament of the durability of this hardened blade. And you can see this sword being so lightweight, easy to accelerate, but lacking the mass on top in comparison to other katanas. So I deliberately held back, used about 50% of my force, and you can see a hard plastic like this, you really need all the mass or increased acceleration for the blade to go so cleanly. It still cuts through, don't get me wrong, but look at the wavy edge. So it wasn't fast enough. I was pretty much half-assed a casual swing. Still cuts through. Do some hard impact against a big and immovable object. And look at the edge holding ability of the Surudoi katana and the structural integrity, the durability of the blade, and the hilt construction. To confirm, after the bottle cutting, there's no nick or dulling on the blade. It's still very polished. So let's see. Pretty deep. see, I'm swinging pretty hard. All of these strikes let the blade bury in the wood completely, all the way to the spine. Okay, so a lot of shock coming down because the blade does not vibrate like spring steel blades do. So the vibration eventually got transferred all the way to the user. The main hand is fine, the vibration note is there. The offhand is what suffers the most. Yeah. If I use one hand, this is actually very comfortable. And you can hear the vibration of the blade because the blade is made of spring steel. There's a bit of spring, but because it's so thick, it's very rigid. Okay, pretty hard strike. As you can see, remove the bark here and a lot of scratch. The tree sat on the blade. I think I can remove that relatively easily. Very hard strikes, as you can see, against this pretty dry trunk. Yeah, these are definitely what's gonna bend traditionally made nihonto. Now let's see. Okay, the edge is still in pretty good shape. Maybe tiny bit of glinting here and there. Not really. I bet that if you wipe the blade with oil paper, just clean it, it's still as good as before. The edge is. Just clean up all the gunk, all the debris. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, it's still pretty sharp. Tiny amount of glinting here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty sharp. And just look at the edge, the spine, perfectly straight. Now, I'm gonna slap the blade against the side of the trunk. So, pretty hard smack. See whether there will be any bending, no bending whatsoever. Let's do one direction. Okay, lots and lots of vibration coming down. Still relatively comfortable for this exercise. Okay, now just look at the spine, completely straight. Edge, completely straight. Yeah. Yep, perfectly straight. So it's adequately heat treated. Yep. Yeah. If there's any looseness, it will show in the hilt by now. There are no looseness. Ito wrapping is still solid. Tsuba is 100% solid. Fujikashira, nothing came loose. Abaki, yeah, there's a gap there, but it's very tightly mounted, so no movement whatsoever. Blade is still perfectly straight. Like okay, now, yeah, perfectly straight. Yeah, no bending at all. Very hard strikes, very hard smacks. Yeah. So, excellent heat treatment.
Now, if we look at other components of the blade, you can see here the koshirae of the entire sword is very consistent visually to the seam. You know, surudoi means sharp in Japanese, and if you look at the saya scabbard, you can see it's relatively plain, right? Has a black lacquered finish, but on the upper part of the saya has lots of splash of red paints. This is hand paint by their craftsmen, basically just random splash patterns. And I think this symbolizes blood, just splatter and drops. And I think that goes very well with this overall, sharp scene. Almost on every element, the tsuba, the menuki, and the koshirae, but also on the habaki, you find this tomo sign, which is a Japanese symbol for great wave. Not only that, it's also geometrically prominent. Right? It's almost like a carved pattern, even though it's cast. It has a 3D geometry that pops up from the surface of these fittings. But since it's very rounded, when you handle the sword, it doesn't create any hot spot, right? Generate any discomfort. It's still very ergonomic. You can see on the habaki, it's a very plain one, just a generic brass habaki, but it has laser-etched tomos on the surface. And the menuki on top of the stingray skin wrap has 3 tomos on each side. It look antiqued. It has some cracked patterns. I don't know whether that's intentional, but it looks just fine. It's very consistent with the rest of the hilt. Also, you can see the tomo on the koshirae. I don't know what the texture on the tsuba fushikashira is. Does it symbolize ocean waves, or is it some kind of plant texture, leaf or roots? But they look rather okay. I think they look better in person than on photos. This tsuba has a very iconic shape for Japanese swords. I would say that the usual round shape katana, the maru shape, is overly represented on Japanese swords, whereas many antique tsubas have this very unique geometry that's emulated on this model. This shape of the tsuba is called mokogata, means quince or papaya shape in Japanese. This is quite an iconic shape on traditional tsuba, and it's more unique to Japanese swords than the round marugata and the square hirakakugata and the kakumaru-kata. Yet reproduction katanas rarely replicate this type of tsuba. The rim of the tsuba is polished, so I would say the brass looks rather nice when polished. It also has an antique color, so it's not a bright yellow color. I think that's very much appreciated. Overall, there's only 2 complaints on the fushikashira. One is that the copper habaki is of very generic shape, and you can see on one side it's fitted rather well with minimal gap between the habaki and blade. On the other side, there's a huge gap. Not only that, you can definitely see this habaki is made for a blade of thicker cross section. It's probably one of the parts being generic habaki, and they have a laser etched tomo on the surface. I would recommend them to have a very tailor-made habaki for this blade, because this is visually very jarring. And when you sheath the sword, it can also create some friction that make the blade stuck. Although when I use it, it doesn't really ever happen. Pretty much it slides into the saya without any problem. But it's just that on traditional Japanese swords, they are very tightly fitted. So I think this should be corrected. Of course, functionally, this doesn't really create a lot of problem issue so far, at least. I'm not sure whether this will make the habaki loosen up. But as a washer for the blade, when you sheath it, it does the job. It doesn't slide all the outside saya, even when you shake it. But you can unlock the sword very easily, and functionally it's sound. The other problem with the hilt fitting is the fuchi on this one. It seems to be a custom-made fuchi to match the rest of the design. It does that well, but you can see both the thickness and the width of the habaki does not match dimension of this suka, this grip. So on one side particularly, it sticks out and it can potentially catch on you, and the edge is kind of sharp. Even though when I use the sword, I didn't really feel it. But I suppose there's a chance that when there's an impact, your finger will just catch onto this ledge and there will be some discomfort. I think that's a relatively easy fix. Either you just lessen the width of this fuchi, both the width and the thickness, obviously, or you make the ito wrapping a little bit thicker near the collar. And this is done actually on the second katana they sent me. And you can see on this one here, the epi katana, the custom-made fuchi also is broader and thicker than the tsuka. But they made the tsuka wrapping a little bit thicker just when it transitions to meet the fuchi. So there's no problem at all. There's no hot spot when you handle it. But visually, it's a little bit weird. Of course, you can also fix it in some other ways. For example, you can increase the dimension, the width of the tsuka when it meets this collar, the fuchi. You see, there's a very subtle hourglass geometry here. In the center, it's narrower. And near the koshirae and the fuchi, they are broader. So you can obviously make it a little bit wider to match the width of the fuchi. The koshirae fits pretty well. There's no hot spot at all. The transition is pretty flush. And the ito wrapping on this tsuka, I will say, is competent. Right? It's very tight, even though the knots can be moved by about half a millimeter if you really peel it backward. But it doesn't really, create any chance for them to loosen up with frequent use. And I can see that the same wrapping, the stingray skin, it's a real one. The nodules are not particularly big. That's okay. And I also appreciate that it's not lacquer in any white paint. It just has this natural semi-transparent look to it, so it looks natural. I totally appreciate that. You can see that there's some ledge. So this indicates that they probably didn't do an inlay of the salmon panel to the tsuka wooden core. And I advise them to implement this because you then wouldn't have like a ledge, right, on the side of the tsuka to stick out. Visually, it's a little bit jarring, but it's not very apparent, obviously. But also, when you handle the tsuka, it's okay. It doesn't really, create any discomfort or anything. So I think functionally, none of the complaints are really very severe. They should be fixed rather easily. For the price they charge, at $150, I don't know whether they will go back to the MSRP of $188, but even at that price range, it's very reasonable. At $155, this is basically, the only offering on the market that comes with a Unokubi-Zukuri blade geometry. Not only that, they implemented it correctly to make it both lively, it's very fast, very easy to use as a training tool, but also durable enough with modern carbon steel with spring temper. You can see there's some spring to it, but the edge is highly polished, very sharp for test cutting, and the blade is very durable. It's still rather thick and rigid. If you can see here, when I cut with it, hard bottle, I did a diagonal ascending cut. Obviously, I didn't put in a lot of power. The hard bottle requires a lot of speed to go through cleanly. It still went through. You can see the edges are wavering, but it was still a competent cut, even with only half of the power output. So it means that even though the blade didn't carry a lot of speed, it was still rigid enough to force through the hard bottle. In conclusion, the Romance of Man Surudoi Katana is a very compelling offer at $155. It's able to provide a very unique, rare Unokubi-Zukuri blade geometry and cross-section on a budget. True to its namesake, it's sharp and very lively in its handling. It's very refined edge geometries. It's durable and resilient, even when it's beat to hell. It escaped pretty much unscathed with only some minor scratches on the upper portion of the blade. The edges is able to retain its sharpness throughout, and there are many unique design elements on the koshirae, the hilt components. It has a unique, strong, and consistent motif throughout. So even at its original MSRP, I think it's a very good offer for beginners and collectors alike. If you enjoy light and nimble swords, definitely give this sword a shot. It's not overly demanding when it comes down to techniques, it's relatively forgiving, and if you throw any bad cuts with suboptimal edge alignment, it's still able to survive, wouldn't take a set. The blade will remain true, and the edge doesn't require a lot of maintenance. So this is a strong showing by Romance of Men. However, if you are interested in their even more interesting offering, the Ebi Katana, that has tons of unique features on not just the hilt components, but also on the blade, stay tuned. Next week, I'm planning for a review of the Romance of Men Ebi Katana with the ocean theme. Until then, please like and subscribe.